Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Pakistan Policy Symposium. Thank you, everyone, for being here. What a great day 1. We had an excellent and very dynamic day yesterday. We covered US-Pakistan relationships in detail, and we identified opportunities, challenges, as well as we had some reality checks that we came across. We also discussed the Pakistan-Afghanistan critical future, and at the very least, that was quite a colorful conversation from my perspective. And lastly, I think we ended the day with women's entrepreneurship and heard some really exciting opportunities and possibilities that were identified. In the spirit of pathways to change and to set the mood tone for day 2, I would like to cherry pick some positive comments and potential opportunities for Pakistan from our opening remarks by Deputy Assistant Secretary Ensher yesterday. So a few of these include Pakistan has an opportunity to use all of its influence to ensure that Afghans can vote in security and help Afghanistan achieve a representative government. Pakistan has shown that it can address terrorism on its territory when it's determined to do so. The new government has the opportunity to be the US's partner in bringing peace and stability in Afghanistan and prosperity and security to Pakistan, and doing so would be beneficial to both. The government also has an advantage because the PTI government served in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which has a border with Afghanistan, so the Prime Minister understands the conflict quite well. As far as the kind of economic and regional play for Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan has the potential to be a leader in the region economically and politically. It sits at the crossroads of many large and growing economies. It has a large entrepreneurial capable population and is building infrastructure linking to the broader region. Even as Pakistan grapples with the balance of payments crisis and has approached the IMF, the new civilian government very much has an opportunity to adapt the much needed structural reforms to consecutively transform the economy for the better. Many of the fundamentals are there. Pakistan has a sizable English-speaking opportunity with an entrepreneurial spirit, and majority of whom are 30 years old or under and has a very strong IT base. Many foreign companies, including US companies, are committed to investing in Pakistan, and their work has paid off with strong growth and profits. Many large corporations have permanent offices in Pakistan, including 65 of the American Business Council companies in Pakistan, which directly employ close to about 1 million Pakistanis. Those are some of the kind of highlights that I'd like to capture from yesterday's opening remarks. And to set the tone for what to expect for day 2, today we'll be discussing, after the opening remarks, the economic future, what are the immediate, short-term and long-term economic possibilities for Pakistan. We will have a panel right after, which is very much linked, is the diaspora. The current government has called upon the overseas Pakistanis for support. So what can the diaspora do to help catalyze, further push this economy forward? And lastly, obviously, we have to discuss state, society, and extremism. We have to cover that topic, and that's part of the agenda. In terms of outcomes, as we have already discussed yesterday, but to recap for everyone's benefit, at the end of the symposium, we would like to synthesize key takeaways from across the 2 days and share that with all interested stakeholders. These could potentially be both administrations. We have collected a great amount of intellectual capital, 30 speakers that have come and spoken across 6 panels. So to capture their insights and thoughts would be the very minimum that we can do, and share that academic perspective and policy context with the key interested stakeholders. As far as just to refresh everyone, and there may be some new people in the room, a little bit about Indus. My name is Shahzad Habib. I serve as the special advisor to Indus. Indus is a unique diaspora-run think tank. While there are many Pakistan initiatives and larger think tanks, we would like to consider Indus more of a pure play, a diaspora-run think tank that focuses on and fills that particular opportunity. Indus's focus is a policy dialogue and platform for relevant issues for Pakistan, youth development leadership for a peer-to-peer model, and engaging on topics such as civil liberties, tolerance, and the rights of the individuals, and lastly, community integration in homeland USA. As I said yesterday, what makes Indus unique is the fact that Indus truly believes that excellent ideas or the best ideas for public reform change comes from the academic world. Think tanks, universities, and research organizations, and Indus itself is one such idea that draws upon powerful scholars, thinkers, and writers that are that are focused on a progressive and politically stable Pakistan. Indus has no political affiliations here in the US or Pakistan. Indus is a non-partisan, self-directed, independently funded, objective entity. Again, thank you again for being here today and the Wilson Center and the Indus team. With that said, I will call upon Mr. Kugelman for his remarks.
Well, thank you, Shahzad, and the Wilson Center really appreciates the partnership that we have with your organization. It's been terrific. So good morning, everyone. I am Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia and the Deputy Director with the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you all to our second day of our Pakistan Policy Symposium. Very quick note about the Wilson Center. We're chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue, and in order to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. And we aim to build a bridge between academia and public policy. And all of this is done in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD. So the core objective of this Pakistan Policy Symposium is to have a series of forward-thinking discussions on a broad array of issues. It builds on the Wilson Center's prior work, which has consistently applied a wide lens to Pakistan, when many, particularly in this town, tend to view it through a narrow prism of security. And so this event really marks our latest effort to give Pakistan the full and broad-based attention it deserves. This symposium is really an effort to try to step back from the noise and thoughtfully take stock of Pakistan's future, and it aims to tease out some practical and actionable policy recommendations for Pakistan in the coming years. And our overarching question is how Pakistan can capitalize on its opportunities and overcome its challenges. And we've instructed our speakers not to get bogged down in past history, and we've succeeded to some extent with that, to be forward-thinking in their comments about what should and should not, and what can and cannot be done in the future. So yesterday, as was noted by Shahzad, we had some very engrossing discussions, the early ones related to Pakistan's relations with the U.S. and with Afghanistan, and how and if they can get around the obstacles that are there to achieve a workable degree of cooperation. And I think the best word to characterize these discussions was sobering. And perhaps the best reaction to them was a reality check. And I think we heard that from Shahzad as well. It was very instructive that we had a top a top U.S. official articulating Washington's thinking on Pakistan. He laid out a vision for broader cooperation, but he hit on one of the key tension points in the relationship in the first few minutes of his speech, that being the issue of terrorist sanctuaries. We also had a panel discussion on U.S.-Pakistan relations, and there were discussions of potential areas of convergence, ranging from counterterrorism to economic issues, and of course Afghanistan. But there was also a recognition that the current mood and environment will make it very difficult to have discussions around those issues. So after we re-energized ourselves at lunch, we came back and had a discussion on Afghanistan and how the U.S., Pakistan, and Afghanistan can partner on a possible endgame. And we had a very spirited conversation. For those of you that will hear will remember, at times it became somewhat combative. But ultimately, it was a very useful discussion in that it amplified the challenges that are there and trying to find ways to work together. But then we ended the day with a discussion on women's entrepreneurship. And then the tenor and the tone of the conversation and also the mood in the room changed significantly. I think the ambiance really morphed from one that was sort of charged to one that was hopeful and inspiring. So we heard a whole lot about the challenges that women face in the economy, but we also heard a number of success stories about Pakistani women entrepreneurs, Pakistani American women entrepreneurs, both from panelists and from some people in the audience. I think that that's a type of good news story about Pakistan that we don't hear enough about around these parts. You've already heard from Shahzad what our main focuses will be today. Let me just leave you with a few reminders. All of the programming today will be in this room. Lunch will be across the hall. There'll be coffee outside available throughout the day. But remember, or those that you were here yesterday, do not bring your food and drink in this room because it's not permitted. This conference is being live streamed. We encourage that all of you here, but also watching around the world, to live tweet using the hashtag #PTCPakistan. So with that, we're going to transition into our opening session, our opening address. And I'm going to turn things over to Bill Milam to do that. Bill Milam is someone who's well known to probably most everyone in this room. He is a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. He is a former ambassador to Pakistan and Bangladesh. He's very knowledgeable about both of these countries and the broader region. And he's been my longtime partner, not in crime, but in very useful and lawful pursuits here at the Wilson Center. So with that, I will turn things over to Bill.
Well, thank you, Michael. We didn't applaud for Michael. For a longtime partner, I have to do that. And some of those things probably were close to a crime, but we'll not talk about those today. I have the very pleasant duty of introducing the speaker, who will speak for about, I guess, 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll be able to berate him with questions. This is Ishrat Hussain, who is, and I have to read this because it's a very long title. He's the advisor to the Prime Minister on institutional reform with the status of federal minister, and he is a member of the Economic Committee of the Cabinet. Therefore, I expect we'll hear something about economics today. I've known Ishrat for, I guess, 20 or so years. He just told me this morning I was his first visitor when he assumed the title of state bank governor, which was governor of the state bank is the official title, which he assumed in 1999. I had not been there very long myself. And he had that role until 2006, and then after that he was dean of the Institute of Business Administration for about 10 years, 8 years, I guess. He has an MA from Williams College, a PhD from Boston University, and he worked at the World Bank from 1979 to 1999, I think, until he went to the State Bank of Pakistan. And I was amazed when I was reading his bio this morning, just to catch up on him, that I had forgotten that when his first duty at the World Bank was to work on Liberia, where I served for 5 years in 2 different assignments. So we have a number of things in common. But I think I would now turn the podium over to him. I don't know, Ishrat, if you want to speak from the podium or not, but please start. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be back at Woodrow Wilson. He didn't mention that I spent a year at this center and wrote my book, Governing the Ungovernable, which I must say has now become a bestseller, has sold 10,000 copies in hardcover, and the first edition of the paperback has already been sold out. So I'm very grateful to Woodrow Wilson Center for providing me the opportunity to produce that work. Michael has given me very clear instructions that I'm not going to talk about the institutional reforms because he's heard me so many times. And we have been working together. We produced a monograph at the Woodrow Wilson Center of the January 2017 conference also. So what I would like to do is to submit to you as to what the current economic situation is, but I will try to create this scenario as the institutional economists call as a result of path dependence, and allude to some of the structural imbalances which have led Pakistan to the current economic predicament. In my humble view, there are 5 or 6, I would say 5 at least, imbalances which the country has been facing for quite some time, except the period of 2002 to 2008, when the economy was growing very rapidly, 7.5% per year on average with investment going up to 23%, national savings going up to 20%, foreign direct investment of $5 billion coming in. Except that, and exports doubling in 5 years' time, and inflation under control. Except that period, Pakistan's imbalances are that we have higher level of government expenditure, which is not financed by taxation, but by borrowing, both external and internal. And it is a situation where even now for the current expenditures, you have to borrow. And that, I think, is not a very pleasant situation for the future. The second imbalance is that unlike other countries in the South Asia region, and I'm not even taking China as a yardstick because China is just an exceptional case, even compared to India and Bangladesh, our savings rates are very measly 12 to 13%, and our investment ratio is about 15 to 16%. And therefore, our current account deficit last year was about 6% because the domestic savings had actually declined, even below 12%. The third one is that in early 2000s, 80% of our imports were financed by our export earnings. As of last year, only 40% of our imports are financed by domestic export earnings. So you have a huge gap of almost 60%, which you have to resort in order to fill in that trade imbalance. And the fifth is that requirements of the human resources and talent to contribute to the economy are not really commensurate, both in the quantity or quality, with the supply. We have graduates coming out of our universities who do not have the skill sets which can make a contribution as far as the economic growth and development is concerned, and they remain unemployed. But we have a huge demand for technicians, for vocational and technical skills, for engineers, for scientists in many other fields in emerging technologies, and we are not producing them. So that is the fifth imbalance. So considering this, we are again back for macroeconomic stabilization because we have huge current account deficit as well as the fiscal deficit, which have to be reduced to manageable proportions. But this time, the idea is that we have to embed this macroeconomic stabilization program in a medium-term structural reform package. Because otherwise, if we do not carry out those reforms on the structure, we will continue to have these episodes of going back to the growth instability syndrome as far as our economy is concerned. So the present government has four basic thrusts as far as the economic transformation agenda is concerned. The first of all, it is that it wants to actually try to deal with the real sectors of the economy. Because unless you devote attention to your real sectors of the economy, you are not either going to be able to have a sustained growth pattern or poverty reduction. So, and the other problem we are facing is that water, which is irrigation water, which is the backbone of Pakistan's agriculture, is becoming scarce. So the first idea is, how do we increase the productivity of water per acre of land and use water conservation techniques in order to have the productivity from the present land areas to meet the future demands for food, fibers, and feed stock. That requires access to finance, which is very much limited right now to the large scale farmers or the medium scale farmers. We have now a water policy where there would be certain distributional efficiencies built in order to make sure that instead of flooding, we go to sprinkler and drip irrigation. The third one is how to revamp our livestock sector, because as the incomes of the population increase, there is a switch in the demand from cereals and grains to meat, poultry, fruits, and feedstock for livestock industry. So that is something we have to create. And finally is the question of the agriculture sector's value addition and processing. Because if you do not have the processing done, the middleman actually who takes a commodity captures a large margins. So neither the consumer is able to benefit at these urban areas, nor the farmer is able to get good incomes. So the intermediation costs right now are very high. But if you have value addition in the processing of the agriculture products, then both the consumers as well as the producers do benefit from that. Now, going back to the other problem which we have is the manufacturing and SME sector. In the large scale manufacturing which is organized, we have over taxation. 65% of the total tax collection burden falls on the manufacturing sector, whose contribution has gone down from 15% of GDP to 13%. So there are people who are making money in the services sectors, in real estate, in stock market, in other trading activities, but they're not paying taxes. So our tax GDP ratio remains about 10 to 15%. It is highly distorted, and therefore we have to broaden tax base and bring down the tax burden on the manufacturing sector. We have to create jobs for the youth because 60% of the population is below the age of 30. And that is, I think, something we have to really look after. So it's not only their education, technical and vocational, the female education, which is pretty low at this moment, and their labor force participation is quite low. It's only 25% compared to Vietnam, which has 70% female labor force participation rate. We have the PDI government has given what I would call priority to job-creating labor-intensive sectors. And they have identified the small, medium enterprises, housing sector, because the construction industry has linkages with 35 other industries, which has create multiplier effects. And that will also have both the job creation as well as economic growth. And the other one problem, and the previous chairman of the Board of Investment is here, we are pretty low on the ease of doing business. We have created too many obstacles for our private sector to do legitimate business. There are all kinds of inspectors. And I consider this a country which is over-regulated, but also very little regulated. So you have spurious drugs, you have adulterated food, you have environmental and occupational hazards, which should be controlled. But at the same time, you have the factory inspector who can come and shut down the factory, and the export orders are completely, not met. So you have a very, what I call as a disconnect between the real requirements of regulations for consumer protection or for health and environmental purposes, but you have too much regulation as far as the generation of economic activity is concerned. So that is something which really needs to be taken care of. The third aspect of the agenda of reforms for this government, which has actually demonstrated some real success stories in the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where they got elected in 2013, is the revolutionize the social services. And there the emphasis is on education and health sectors and human capital. Because unless we try to invest in human capital and talent, in the knowledge economy of 21st century will be left behind. So both the curriculum as well as the delivery and the pedagogy have to be realigned with the requirements of the economy. Second is the women empowerment. As I said, it's a pity that we have one of the lowest female labor force participation. I just give you one example. We spend 5 million rupees to produce a medical doctor, and the girls do extremely well. So 85% of the class, of the graduating class of a medical college or university is girls. But out of those 85%, only 36% enter the labor force. The remaining just do not join the labor force. So you have shortages of female doctors in the urban areas, in the rural areas, and we are producing doctors which are not actually participating in the labor force. So we have to utilize and find ways whereby we can empower the women and try to make them equal partners as far as the whole economic social development is concerned. The third aspect of this is the social safety nets. We have one of the very successful programs for conditional cash transfer and unconditional cash transfer, which is the Benazir Income Support Program, which caters to 5.3 million households. So instead of giving subsidies across the board, this government wants to target the subsidies to these households which are identified, which are very much monitored through electronic means. And they want to channel all the whatever kind of subsidies they want to go through this particular channel. Drinking water supply is another particular problem which leads to the epidemics and the health problems, and also the absenteeism from labor force and the lower productivity. So there is a lot of attention on the drinking water. And the final aspect on the social services is a green growth. They had very successful Million Tree program, which was recognized by the World Economic Forum in its report recently. Now they have gone for 1 billion trees during 5 years, so that the trees can actually be able to capture some of the greenhouse gas emissions. Final, which is close to my area, is the transformation of governance. Because you may have the whole good policies, but the conduit which is providing the services and translating these policies into actions is the governance structure, which is in pretty bad shape. So the 5 ingredients of the governance agenda are establish accountability, and not the kind of accountability which is through the National Accountability Bureau, which creates a lot of harassment and disincentives to the civil servants, but internal accountability for the actions. Then have a very strong local government systems, empower the local governments at grassroots level because all the interactions between the government and citizen, whether it is education, health, drinking water, or social safety nets, takes place at the local government level. So this government has successfully done this in the province of KP, and now they want to utilize that experience and replicate this in Punjab and Balochistan, which are their own provinces right now. They won elections in both the provinces. And this will really, in my view, will be a very important step, because the work I carried out for 2002 to 2007, the surveys clearly showed that the accessibility of a common citizen who neither has connections nor has the money to pay bribes improves when you have a local government system which are accessible and can get things done, as compared to the members of the Provincial Assembly who are sitting at the provincial headquarters, or the member of the National Assembly who are sitting in Islamabad. The third one is depoliticize the police. The police is a very ugly face in Pakistan. People are damn scared of approaching for even the reporting of crimes. But the experiment in the Northwest, or KP, showed that you can actually use the electronic FIR system, so there is no interaction between the police inspector and the complainant, and you can file this electronically. So the use of electronic means and e-governance in order to improve the access of services by the common citizen is something which will depoliticize, create transparency, and also hold accountability. We have a very hyperactive, superior judiciary, but the access to justice for the common citizens at the lower level is very, very poor. And one of the reasons that people do not believe in the formal court system is that it takes 10 years or 12 years in order to get the resolution of their disputes to the culmination. And the property rights, which is the cornerstone of the private sector, private sector growth, is affected because of that. And the final is the civil service reform. The civil services have lived on an old model which we inherited from the Britishers, and with some haphazard, piecemeal changes, it has remained intact. So what we have to do is to create a situation where the country has a responsive and an efficient civil service. This is a tall agenda, and I don't believe this is going to happen in 5 years' time. But at least somebody has to take the initiative in order to move this forward. The reform agenda is not coterminous with the 5-year electoral cycle. And that's why there has always been a resistance to reforms. We have to have a political consensus among all major political parties that this agenda is 10, 15 years to take shape. But we have to carry out this in small steps and build on the success factors. And that is one of the major risks to this agenda. Whether 5 years later, whether a new government comes in and reverses all this work which is being initiated. And I have personal experience. There are a lot of good programs, including the local government empowerment, the Higher Education Commission, the transfer of powers to of education and health to the grassroots levels. They were all reversed in 2008 when a new government came in. So my sort of worry is whether we would have a broad consensus around this agenda, which is good for the country, but the losses are upfront because there are losers and the winners in the reforms. And the losers can organize themselves right away. The winners will appear somewhere in distant future. They don't have the power to mobilize and organize themselves. And this disconnect of the time dimension between the losses of reforms, losses from reforms, and the gains from reforms is now very well established in economic development literature as something which requires a long-term political agenda which is blessed and endorsed by everyone. The second part I want to speak about is a highly misunderstood, especially in the United States, topic, which is the CPEC. And for those of you, even before joining the government, I carried out some research when I was at the Institute of Business Administration, and it is now available on the website of CPEC-center.pk, in which we have done an economic appraisal of the CPEC. Let me give you some broad features because there is a lot of, I say, fuzziness and fogginess. The entire CPEC project, which has the commitment over a 15-year period from 2015 to 2030, is for an amount of $45 billion. So you can see the flying numbers, 60, even in Wall Street Journal, I saw a 60 billion number, and I saw another news story, 50 billion, but the number is only 45, which President Xi Jinping committed in 2015 during his visit to Pakistan. There are four components. First is the power generation and transmission lines. $35 billion are allocated out of those 45 billion, 70% for power generation and transmission line. And this is in response to Pakistan's topmost priority, that we had a huge problem of energy shortages which hit our economy. Just to give you one simple example, in 2010, 2011, we had reached $25 billion of exports. And had we continued on the same trajectory of the historical growth rates of exports, in 2017-18, we would have reached almost $35 billion of exports. So the $12 billion which we lost out, not 12, 13 billion we lost out because of the energy shortages, because our exporters could not meet their orders as there was no gas and there was no electricity. And those orders were diverted to Cambodia, to Vietnam, and to Bangladesh. So we had a huge problem of energy shortages. We won't have this kind of crisis we are facing today if our exports had reached $35 billion. Our current account deficit would have been just 1 to 2% of GDP, which is manageable. So this was the enormity of the problem. We have an IPP policy since 1994, which is open to everyone. Nobody came to the rescue of Pakistan. The Chinese responded to, and under the same policy of 1994, they have committed to invest $35 billion. There are two problems as far as I can see and my analysis shows. They went for two coal-fired projects on imported coal. In my view, that was not the right thing to do. Yes, we have LNG projects, wind, solar, and gas, but not on imported coal. Yes, indigenous coal projects should have been taken, but these are only two out of the 23 projects which are under completion. During the 4 years, Pakistan was able to add almost 6,000 to 7,000 megawatt, and its exports for the first time in 2017-18 grew by 14% because the energy shortages were gone. There are 3 hydroelectric projects which will be completed in 2021. And the financial arrangement is exactly the same which is available to everyone. Even the American companies, when they established the AES, established the IPP in Pakistan, they got a 17% rate of return guaranteed on their equity. And that is exactly what the Chinese are getting. So this whole hullabaloo, as if the Chinese are going to take the energy to their shores, is totally misplaced. Yes, wind and solar, because these were new technologies, the rate of return was higher than 17%. But that's available to everyone. That's not only tailor-made for the Chinese. Pakistani investors, private sector, who have gone for wind and for solar, they're getting the same rate of return. The second component is the infrastructure, which is the corridors from Gwadar port all the way to Kashgar. And that is almost $5 to $6 billion. It is a concessional government-to-government loan, which is 2% interest rate and 25-year repayment, 5-year grace period. So the payments do not start till 21, 22. The total loans which have been contracted from China in our stock of $95 billion is only 10%. And this can be verified from all the documents which are available on the website of the Ministry of Power, on the Ministry of Finance, on the State Bank of Pakistan. 60% of our loans are to the multilateral agencies, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and Islamic Development Bank. So those who allege that our problem arises because of the loans from China do not look at the facts. They are very much taken by their own prior views. The third component of the CPEC is the Gwadar port development, which requires water, international airport, roads, expressways, and that is being given as grant money to Pakistan, except the power project, which is under the IPP mode. So that is $1 billion of grant money. And the fourth is the special economic zones, which are 9 industrial zones, will be established along these corridors from Gwadar to Kashgar, in Balochistan, in KP, in Gilgit-Baltistan, in Azad Kashmir, in Islamabad, in Punjab, and Sindh. There, the incentive package will be available to every investor from either Pakistan or outside Pakistan. There will be no preferential treatment for the Chinese investors. The idea is that China is becoming less competitive in some textile items. So they will relocate their industries in Pakistan because they still have the marketing and access to international markets. Therefore, these goods which will be fabricated in Pakistan at a much lower cost would then be exported in the value chain to China. But these are still at the early stages. And this has not taken off because the work is still going on. The present government has added 3 additional items to this. One is the socio-economic development of the backward districts of Balochistan, which are being, traversed for the corridors. So education, health, drinking water, roads connecting these districts to the corridor is something they want to add in order to remove the regional economic disparities and uplift the standards of the most backward districts of Pakistan. The second is that agriculture is neglected very much as far as the new technologies are concerned. As I said, we have water shortages, so we have to switch over from the existing methods of production to the new methods of production. And China has done a very good job in that, and we would like to benefit from the transfer of technology from China in order to use the water more carefully and more prudently and conserve that. And the third one is that we have to look at the special economic zones, that they do not affect our existing industries. So the criteria for the new industries will be not only export orientation, but those new areas where Pakistan has not yet made any headway. For example, in pharmaceuticals and chemicals, we have a competitive advantage, but we haven't been a big exporter as compared to India or Bangladesh. So we want to establish these industries which do not displace the existing industries but are venturing into new areas like electronics, IT. IT is something which is both very attractive to our youth, but also there's a huge demand in the world, and we can supply that. So there is a reorientation of the industrial zones. And these negotiations are going on between Pakistan and China. And the Prime Minister is going to visit China in the first week of November, and I think some announcements will be made. So I took some time in order to clarify what I consider, having lived in Washington, following the media here, also the think tanks, there is a great deal of fogginess about the CPEC, so I thought, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ishrat. That was great. We are, according to the official schedule, we're actually out of time, but I think our leaders would give us a few minutes for questions. Am I not right? Since we started late. That's very nice of them. Now I'm going to ask the first question because I think I've been silent over here for a long time, and it's hard. It's really hard. Listen, Ishrat, first of all, let me say that maybe other people in the room thought that CPEC was your big balance of payments problem, but I never did. I think it's going to contribute to the balance of payments problem. But I want to ask you, because on the way home last night in the metro, I looked at my phone and there was a breaking news from Pakistan that said that the Prime Minister was having second thoughts about the IMF. More or less it said that. It said that he thought that he would wait some more before they really decided to go to the IMF for what we know is a very serious balance of payments problem. And I mean, I looked in the papers and so forth this morning. I didn't see anything, so this may be some fake news placed by a Russian troll. I don't know. But I need to ask you about this whole question of the balance of payments and the IMF, because even if you, there was an Article 4 meeting recently, and out of that came the idea that you had decided to go to the IMF. Now maybe you're having second thoughts. Now maybe not. I don't know. But I'd like to hear one from you as in your capacity as the advisor on institutions and a member of the Economic Committee of the Cabinet. Isn't this balance of payments problem serious enough that you have to go to the IMF sooner or later? And second, there are several parts to this question. If you, the longer you wait, won't it be the worse than if you went sooner? That's sort of the first question. The second question is, it's not CPEC per se, but it's your fiscal situation, your fiscal policies, which you alluded to in the earlier parts of your remarks, that are the real problem here. So what do you see for fiscal reform that, because the percentage of revenue, percentage of GDP of revenue is something like 10%. Maybe it's a little higher, maybe it's a little lower. I don't know. It keeps changing, but it's not very good. Can you give us an answer on what happens with the IMF and why it's taking so long and what the problems are and where you see the reforms that are needed to get past this immediate crisis?
Thank you very much for asking these very pertinent questions. Till the last day I left, which was on 16th, there was no indication whether the government was having second thoughts, because they've already approached and formally requested the IMF, and IMF sending a mission which is coming in the first week of November. There was a mission which was in September last week. They carried out an appraisal of what the current situation is.
That's basically Article 4, right?
No, it was not Article 4. It's a special mission in anticipation of our, going to the IMF. So I'm not aware. Now, there is one newspaper and one TV channel which always distorts whatever the Prime Minister says.
Only one?
Only one. Only one. I would say that, at least in economic matters. I don't know about political matters because that's not my forte. But in economic matters, when I follow other newspapers and I follow that one, there's always a distortion. So I saw 4 newspapers today, and I saw only one of them saying this, what you said. 3 other newspapers, including a very respectable newspaper like Dawn, didn't say anything of the sort that we are having second thoughts. And I will be very surprised if we are having second thoughts, because we need the IMF support in order to overcome the macroeconomic stabilization program. And secondly, we've already done a few things which the IMF has publicly acknowledged, which is to come up with a new budget where the fiscal deficit has been reduced from 6.6% to 5.1%. So we've already taken some measures in order to bring down the fiscal deficit. We've increased the gas prices across the board, exempting only the very small users of the gas by an average of almost 143%, which is a big shock. We have imposed regulatory duties on non-essential imports so that the demand for luxury imports like the Porsches and the Bentleys which were being sold in Pakistan could be reduced, and we could save some money in that respect. So there are some measures, and there will be other measures which would we agree with the fund. So personally, I do not see that there would be a second thought about it, but I may be wrong because I'm here in Washington, and what is happening in Pakistan, I'm not aware. But till the last moment of 16th, when I left, there was no indication that there was anything of the sort which you are pointing out.
Well, what about the fiscal side? What do you
I
think?
said fiscal side, we just had done a 1.5% reduction in the fiscal deficit, already done.
Are you
Rick
planning,
wants-
though, a longer-term reform?
we have. We have completely changed the FBR. We are using a database whereby we are sending notices to the non-filers who are outside the tax net, and we are going to impose penalties on them. Rick?
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Rick, you first. Wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourself. I know you, but maybe some people don't.
Okay.
And use the microphone.
Rick Olson with CSIS, retired U.S. diplomat. Dr. Hussain, thank you very much for a very comprehensive overview of the new government's approach to economics. I was surprised that in your list of 4 you did not include energy as one of the main thrusts for the government. You did cover it in the CPEC section, but only talked about power generation. And to the best of my knowledge, the question of circular debt continues to exist. It seems to me there are structural problems still in the energy sector. But do you regard the question, or does the government regard the question of energy as having been solved somehow, or does that continue to be a problem that has to be addressed?
It's a part of our fiscal policy. It's not part of the energy. Energy is now surplus, so we don't really going for energy policy. But the problem is in the distribution companies. Out of the 9 companies, 4 of them are causing 75% of the losses, and all the deficits which are being accumulated in circular debt are originating from these 4 companies. So they have to find specific solutions, either to privatize those, to give them to management contracts, or bring about new managers. So it is more on the public sector enterprises problem in the public finances rather than the energy problem. But it's a real problem. You're quite right. But I didn't want to say that because in the previous 5 years, the entire emphasis of the previous government was on energy, which they, as I pointed out, they have overcome the shortages.
This gentleman right here. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a little hard to see from up here with these lights, so wave and let me know if you want to ask questions.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Nasser Khilji. I'm with the U.S. Treasury Department. I'm an economist. But the question that I ask has nothing to do with the U.S. policy here. Following up on Bill Millam's question, and also looking at your portfolio, one of them is austerity. So you haven't talked anything about the austerity part. You've talked about the taxation, how you plan to raise them, and you've talked about regulatory taxes and stuff. But in terms of the austerity part, I have 2 questions here. Number one, what exactly are you going to do in terms of cutting the expenditures of the government, which is another problem? You have a taxation side and you have a spending side. So how are you going to manage that? And secondly, as you know, the biggest elephant in the room that we never talk about is the defense, military. How are you going to tackle that part of how to get that down? Because that's a big chunk of your spending. Thank you.
I don't know if you've read my book. I have done a great analysis on the historical evolution of the defense expenditure. Defense expenditure is not the big elephant anymore. It is less than 3% of GDP. It is only 18% of our public expenditure, so it's no longer. 1,500 billion out of 4,500 billion we collect goes on debt servicing costs. That is the big elephant. And that can only be tackled if we reduce our borrowing, both external and internal. And that can happen if we try to reduce our fiscal deficit. So the trajectory is 5.1% of fiscal deficit, 4.5%, 3.8%, and 3%. So that is the stable. Both sides, both sides. Big head is the public sector enterprises, which are bleeding us like anything. That is the big task. So we are going to have a holding company whereby we will transfer all the assets of these companies into professional managers, not the ministries. Ministries have actually been responsible for this recklessness of the public enterprises. And this will be professional expenditure, professional management, which will decide whether we privatize them, or we can turn them around, or commercialize them, or wind them up, or merge them, or liquidate them. So they will carry out this exercise, which hopefully will be reducing our expenditures on the transfers and the grants to these companies, which are causing a huge, fortune as far as are concerned. And I give you one simple example. During our time, the banking sector was incurring a loss of 45 to 50 billion. They were all state-owned companies. We privatized them. 80% of the banking assets today are in the hands of the private sector. 100 billion rupees are being collected from the banking sector as taxes and dividends. So instead of being a loss-making body, they are now contributing to the, exchequer. This is a model which has happened in telecom sector, which is creating a huge amount of contribution to the exchequer. So we have successful models, and we want to follow that model.
Well, that's one elephant in the room that's dead now. And I'm glad to hear that. And I'm really happy to hear about your attack on the public enterprises, because that has been a bleeding sore for many years. I can't. Let's see. This lady right here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if Asad Umar, the finance minister, is the right man for the job at this moment when you're in difficult financial times.
Can you just elaborate why you think so?
I wanted you to elaborate.
Well, you don't have to answer that question if you don't want to.
Oh, he is. I mean, I just wanted to know the basis of your skepticism about his competence as the Minister of Finance. I just don't know. I haven't heard this before from anyone, so I was very curious.
I'm getting signals. Mr. Kugelman is pointing at his wrist. I think it's the watch on his wrist. I don't know. So we're going to have to end, but I'm going to take a couple more questions, please. I'll take them 2 questions, and then we'll and get answers to those, and then we'll end. And I haven't been in the back of the room. There's a man back here with, you. Yeah. And then somebody on the other side.
I mean, the
lady over there. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Ignacio Rodriguez with Tetra Tech. My question is associated with the new government, and as indicated on the NEPRA Act of 2018, which is a regulator, the need for the new government to establish the new policy and plan. My question is associated in the context you had indicated that there was a surplus. Generation surplus in Pakistan. Actually, there's a lot of discussion whether there is actually a real surplus or not. And within that context, particularly associated, one, with price in terms of creating a competitive environment, to what extent clean energy, renewable energy can be competitive with all the old power plants in Pakistan, let alone these coal new generation projects. But also, as we know well, the transmission and distribution constraints in Pakistan.
We need short questions. I'm getting very dirty stares from right down here.
Okay, so the question is associated. Based on all this, how do you see this question? Is there a surplus? Is there a deficit? Is there opportunity for new generation as renewable energy?
Go first.
Okay.
And the lady here, she gets a question. Sorry,
Yeah.
Trezi, no.
Yeah, she was.
That she had her hand up. No,
Yeah.
I'm pointing in this direction. It could be anybody there, but it's her.
Thank you. I'm ex-civil servant from Federal Board of Revenue, and I do consulting on the tech side. So my question, I had an elaborate question, but I want to be very brief here.
Brief.
Very brief. So I want to ask you about the word that you used, the fogginess, not only here in DC, but also back home. The fogginess between the policy when the government made an announcement and when we do not get to see the results or any explanations, the concrete explanation from the government side. I'm sorry, I'm taking you on a statement that you just made, that we have reformed FBR completely.
No.
You
I
just
didn't
made
say
the
that.
statement.
No way. Way. They are the first one to be reformed. That's what I said.
So when we look at the 100 days of this government, one of the tasks is reforming FBR, making the appointments. So the people like me who have unfortunately had a PhD, we go beyond the apparent facts. So to me, it's like changing the chairman of the Federal Board of Revenue would not mean the real changes. You know very well how complicated those reforms are. So the problem what we have here in DC and back home as well is like we do not get to see any rebuttals from the government.
Can I answer that, please?
Yeah.
Because we're getting time. This is just the starting point of the reform, that you bring in a competent administrator, but the basic tool is the technology-based risk assessment on the which is now generating notices to the people who should have been in the filer category and they are not. So we are using algorithms in order to give that notices. So it's not human beings which are giving these notices. That is a reform. It's a starting reform because they've identified only 1,000 people, but we want to test this, and there are at least 1 million people who are outside the NEX. That is a reform. Now, on the surplus, 11,000 megawatt is being actually generated in 2021, 2022. That is the plan, which is under different stages. So by that time, we will have the 33,000 megawatts. Our demand at the peak is 25,000 megawatt. So we would have surplus. You're quite right on the distribution. I answered Rick Olson that we have to do something about our distribution companies. They are a complete mess, and they are creating the circular debt. So if we don't succeed in reforming our distribution companies, the energy problem will remain. So I agree with you. Transmission losses are not that great. Transmission losses, as far as the NTDC is concerned, the 500 kVA, not much of a problem. And there now the Chinese are building a very high voltage transmission line from the south to the north. This will be commissioned in about 2 years' time. So that will take care of the problem. But you are quite right on the distribution. If we don't do, we will fail completely in energy shortages.
I'm sorry, I think we're out of time. I wish we could go longer because there are lots of questions, and this has been a very interesting thing, but I think I'm under orders, or at least pressure, to say that this session is ended. I hope you'll show your appreciation for Ishrat with another hand.